Hello everyone, thanks for joining me today. My name's Simon Lewis and I work for Endeavour Energy, who are a distribution supply authority in New South Wales. So today I'm going to be talking about electric and magnetic fields and the health effects that they can have on workers and public, solely from the perspective of a power distributor. So we're not talking about electric fields from mobile phones or high frequency ones, but from what's generated from our power distribution network. So this is what we're going to be having a quick chat about today, and what I would say is that this conversation isn't endorsed by Endeavour Energy, but it's mainly based on the Energy Networks Association work. And the website for more information can be found there, so we're going to be having a good chat about the work that they've done, and in particular about the communication that we've been given to members of the public. And we're going to be going through what is EMF, what happens when you're exposed to electric and magnetic fields, what happens to your body and what the implications of that are, what we can do in order to make the situation a bit safer, and a few case studies that we've done in Endeavour Energy in terms of investigations into electric and magnetic fields. So I wanted to start off as simple as I can. I'm sure you guys are all aware what electricity is and the fact that any sort of propagation of energy is associated with waves, both electric and magnetic. So that picture there is quite simple, which I'm sure you guys are all across. So what I would say is that electric and magnetic fields are completely natural. They're naturally occurring, and they're quite a normal phenomenon. They are associated with energy propagation, which is where there is a risk to people. So if you're exposed to an excessive amount of energy, then it can result in health effects. And so what we're going to be talking about today is low frequency electric and magnetic fields, or mainly around the 50 hertz AC power propagation. So whilst this is low frequency, it's associated with a lower energy. We are talking about the transmission of a large amount of current, so large magnetic fields, as well as at high voltages, which results in high electric fields. So to sort of talk about this a little bit more, electric magnetic fields are quite well understood according to Maxwell's laws. They're proportional to the source, so in other words, the higher the electricity that you're transmitting your power at, the higher the electric field that it'll produce. Similarly for magnetic fields, the higher the current that you're trying to transfer between point A and B, the higher the associated magnetic field will be. The good news about this though is that it is an exponential decay. So the further away you are from the source, the less effect that you're going to be able to see. And what you can see on the slides behind me there is an example of some calculations that we have done for 3 new feeders that we're installing. So this is the magnetic field produced by full load current from a cable that's buried underneath the surface. And we've calculated the magnetic fields at 1 metre above the surface, where people who are walking above it will be exposed. And as you can see there, it's quite a short drop off as you move away from the cable. So the other thing I really want to point out here is that electric and magnetic fields are associated with all sorts of power. So you don't need to have a big transmission line, a big transmission towers outside of your house to be exposed to electric and magnetic fields. Every single item that uses electricity, it also has an electric and magnetic field associated with it. You can see that behind me some typical sort of magnetic fields that you can expect for common items around your house. So what I would say is that anything that consumes electric current and anything that has electricity that's powering it produces an electric and a magnetic field. Most of the apparatus around your house is quite a low voltage, 230 volts typically. So we really would be talking about magnetic fields in this case. But as you can see, there is an exposure to magnetic fields around normal things in your house. And so these are probably on the high side, things that you might want to avoid exposure to for a long period of time. But on the whole, the magnetic fields that they produce are very small. And from a reasonable distance away from any power lines, these magnetic fields that you can see up on the screen from common items, if you're a reasonable distance away from power lines, then they're generally below these values. So you might be more exposed inside your house than you would be walking above a transmission cable or below a big transmission tower. So this is typical. This is anywhere you go, I'll be expecting to see, say, a 2 to 3 milligauss magnetic field. The units that you can see behind me are in microtesla, but there's just a factor of 10 to convert between milligauss and microtesla. But anywhere you go, you will be exposed to some sort of magnetic field. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is, now you know that we're all exposed to magnetic fields, we're all exposed to electric fields, but what does that actually mean in terms of electrical safety? So what I would say is that this is one of the most widely researched areas of radiation, if you can classify it like that. There's been thousands of research papers associated with it. Is the transmission of power a safe thing to do? Is getting power to people's houses something that is putting them in danger? And so the largest area of concern amongst the literature is that of cancer. So we are talking about energy that is being propagated along the physical medium, but adjacent to that physical medium, which is the line or the cable, there is these electric and magnetic fields. And is those fields, that energy that's being propagated through those fields, is that going to cause cancer to people who are exposed to that, particularly for a long period of time? Now the good news is because there has been thousands of research papers, there's been a lot of summarisation of those papers and a lot of recognition in health organisations. So what I'll go through just very quickly with you today is some of the major ones. So the World Health Organization, or WHO, who classifies risk, safety risk of things like contagious diseases, has also had a look at a summary of all the papers that are available in terms of the impact of electric and magnetic fields. As you can see there, it's a very extensive area of study, and the WHO has concluded from current evidence that there is no correlation, no proven correlation between electric and magnetic fields and that of cancer. I would say that the WHO has looked at that from an aggregated sense. There is individual papers which you can quite easily find on the internet, as well as a few fabricated papers, I would say, on the internet around linkages between cancer and electric and magnetic fields, particularly around leukemia or childhood cancer. But those papers have yet to be thoroughly tested and proven, and are not comprehensive enough to be able to prove a linkage between electric and magnetic fields and cancer. So the World Health Organization is not alone. There is an international commission which looks at these sort of sources of radiation. And we've come up with a similar result. So prolonged exposure to magnetic fields, particularly around that childhood leukemia issue that I mentioned before, is not necessarily something that's proven yet. And similarly, the US National Cancer Institute has also done a review of all the papers that are out there and concluded that there is no definitive link between cancer and between electric and magnetic fields. So that doesn't mean that there's no health effects associated with electric and magnetic fields at all. In fact, there are two well-known effects that happen if you are exposed to magnetic fields and electric fields. They're more about instantaneous exposure. So it's not, I have a power line outside of my house and I go to sleep every night outside of it, and that's going to give you cancer over the long term, or other health effects such as headaches and things like that. It's more so if you're exposed to a very high magnetic field or a very high electric field, there could be some health effects. And those health effects are mainly around the interference of your body's natural electric and magnetic fields from the external source. So you can induce a current by being exposed to a magnetic field. You can induce the current inside your body, which then can have effects on things like your eyesight temporarily. It might cause you to black out and not be able to see because the signals from your eyes can't communicate with your brain, associated with these sort of high magnetic fields that you can see on the board there. The other thing I would say about this slide and about these limits is that you can see there's a difference between occupational exposure and general public exposure. So people who are working on power lines and people who are just normal public have different limits. And the main reason for that is one of disproportionate factors. So a member of the public isn't expected to be exposed to this sort of thing. They don't understand what the risks are, and they don't understand that they are being exposed to these sort of risks. So the limits for them are much lower. So we try to expose the public to a lower level, whereas a member of a worker for a utility, for example, knows what the risks are in terms of getting involved with work, and so the levels are higher. And the example that I use for that is around occupational exposure to electric fields. Now, the main risk associated with high electric fields is microshocks. I'm sure you've all walked along a woolen carpet and touched a bit of metal and had a bit of a shock, or maybe had a little bit of a shock from your car. Now, high electric fields cause this same phenomenon. If you've got an unearthed bit of metal, that can build up a charge in a high electric field, and the discharge of that can cause a shock. Now, for a worker for a member of the public who is exposed to this, it's quite a low risk, but for a worker who might be working up a ladder at the time, working at heights on a tower, who is exposed to a high electric field in this manner and is exposed to a shock, they might make a mistake as a result of that, and that might have some other implications for health. So whilst the allowable levels are higher because the workers are trained to know that that is a risk and there is procedures in place to mitigate that, there is that discrepancy between general public and occupational based on the level of risk. Okay, so we know that there is a risk. We know that the link between cancer and electric and magnetic fields in terms of long-term exposure is one that's still being explored and has been by thousands of papers and hasn't been proven to a large extent. In saying that, we still have an obligation to make sure we understand what these electric and magnetic fields are, that we are below the limits that you can see on the slides there, and we do monitor and control that. And so what we do is we do measurements, and you'll see in the following video some examples of some field measurements that we've undertaken both for magnetic fields using the unit you can see on the slide there, as well as electric fields out in the field. So we can measure it, we know what people are exposed to, we know what the limits are, and as a general rule of thumb, as you saw with the magnetic fields that people are exposed to in their houses, and how quickly and exponential the decay is from a line for a magnetic field, generally exceeding the limits is a very difficult thing to do. And so what we find is for most standing directly underneath the power line or standing directly above a cable, the exposure that people have is generally less than these limits, which means they won't get these instantaneous effects of microshocks and of affecting their synapses associated with that high electric field. But that doesn't mean we have to stop here, and this is quite an important concept when we start talking about electrical safety. So whilst there is no conclusive link between magnetic fields and cancer, we have an obligation to make sure that we control that risk to a level that is as low as reasonably practical. That's that alarm term that you can see on the slides there. So it is our obligation to make sure that we minimise the fields that public and staff are exposed to in order to minimise any potential effects. Just because it's improvement doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily any effects. So we do that by following the hierarchy of controls. We tend to try to eliminate the hazard, but obviously people need power, so that's not something we can generally do. We implement a lot of other techniques, which we'll talk about below, mainly sort of engineering techniques, and we also use PPE and signage and other things like that. There is some different mitigations that we use for different people, so workers versus the public, and you can see on the slide behind me an example of a warning sign that we may have on one of our substations in order to warn a worker who is going to go inside that substation that there is high magnetic fields, and if they have a medical implant, whilst they have a low risk of cancer and there is some other effects that are below the limits, it can affect medical implants such as a pacemaker. A high magnetic field might influence the pacemaker and might make it so it doesn't necessarily function correctly. So we use things like warnings to make sure that if people are exposed to if a worker is exposed to high magnetic fields inside of our substation, they're aware of the risks, and that's well controlled. For members of the public, we try to make sure that high magnetic fields and high electric fields are isolated from them. So electric fields, we tend to make sure that our towers are installed as quite high, or the cables are installed quite high, so by the time you reach the ground, the electric field has decayed to close to background levels. And the other thing that we try to do, particularly for the public, is to communicate. And so part of my role at Endeavour Energy is to talk to the public and to discuss for new projects and for existing ones where there is power lines outside of the house, say that somebody is building. We need to make sure we communicate to them in a way that is easy to understand what the effects of these electric fields are. And a lot of the time that's around measurements and around discussions that the magnetic fields that people are exposed to from our power lines aren't necessarily any different to that they're exposed to inside of their houses, inside of everyday life. So this is quite an important slide, and basically what I'm saying is that there isn't necessarily a correlation between a high risk from electric and magnetic fields, but with any safety aspect we need to make sure that we still control the risks. So we do what we can and what's prudent in order to minimise the risk to both our workers and the public. So some of the ways that we do that are up on the slide there. So we talk about construction. So in the slide behind me, there's a few different options for dual circuit cables. And you can see the different magnetic fields simply from different configurations of cables, because as we orient the cables differently in such a way that we cancel out the magnetic fields between the different phases, we can do a lot to minimize the magnetic fields. And so rather than installing, say, a simple line that just goes straight out, as you can see with the high magnetic field there, we can adjust the phases so they're out of sync with each other and do a lot to minimize the magnetic fields. This is at a low cost. It's just simply a different way of connection. It's a very simple thing to do, and it minimises magnetic fields to a large extent. Now, whilst the normal straight lane, those magnetic fields are still compliant with the limits, it would be seen to be a prudent thing and a practical thing to rearrange the cables to minimise that. The other thing we can do, particularly for workers, and what you would have seen in the HV lab at the university here, is we can shield people, mainly from electric fields. Magnetic fields are very difficult to shield as they tend to permeate through most mediums. But electric fields are easily mitigated by the use of a Faraday cage. So you can see a photo there of the HV lab here at the university, and that containing, as well as providing a barrier, the fact that it's made of metal actually contains any high electric fields inside of those laboratories to inside, and is an effective mechanism of shielding. Probably in terms of the hierarchy of controls, probably one of the most effective things that we do that I spoke about earlier is separation. We make sure that our high voltage lines are at a large distance away from members of the public. We have easements around our lines, and we separate people from that in order to minimise their exposure. And where there is the risk of somebody being exposed, we do use signage to warn people of the risk, such as inside our substations. So these are some quite simple tools that you can use and some quite easy things to implement to minimise the risk to the people around there. With the focus being, if something is practical to implement, then we need to in order to make sure that both the workers and the public are safe. So what I'll talk about quickly here is a case study, an investigation that we've done. Now I understand these slides might be a little bit difficult to see, but essentially what we've done is we've done an extensive monitoring program around our network for what electric and magnetic fields that people are exposed to. So on your left there is a substation and measurements that were taken around the substation to try to quantify what magnetic fields and electric fields people are exposed to when they're walking through the substation yards and when they're doing any sort of work. And we found that there is very, very high magnetic fields localised around, as you would imagine, the high current areas, particularly at the secondary cabling from our transformers, where all the current from the substation is channeled through. And these high magnetic fields, they're less than the limits, but what we would advise if anybody is working or exposed to those secondary cables, that we do that under isolated conditions as a preventive avoidance example. The other photo that you can see there is some electric field measurements from one of our transmission lines. So our workers are exposed to high electric fields when they're working under live line conditions. So with the feeder still energised in order to maintain supply to customers, they need to get up close to do works on live transmission lines. And you hear stories along the lines of it causes the hair on the back of your neck to stand up. There might be sort of a feeling of pressure around these lines, and a lot of these sort of physical reactions are associated with high electric fields. So we went through a measuring program to make sure we actually knew what they were exposed to, and that our workers were exposed to levels that are considered to be safe under the safety limits. The other thing we do on a regular basis is any new feeder that we install on the network, we undertake an EMF study. And you can see an example of one of the studies that we've done there. As part of that, we use our modelling software in order to quantify magnetic fields around the lines. And then we can explore the different mitigation techniques. Now, you can see a list there, and this is our standard checklist of things that we can do to minimise electric and magnetic fields. Most of the time it's easy to do, such as rearranging the phases, but in other circumstances it's a physical restriction and a reason why a feeder needs to be run in a particular way. In this particular example, most of the feeder was run in a trefoil arrangement, in in that triangular configuration, most of the magnetic fields tend to be cancelled, as opposed to a flat configuration where there's less cancellation and so there's more exposure to magnetic fields. Now in this circumstance where we're running our cables underneath a road, it's almost impossible to use a trefoil because of the construction techniques that they use. So we would install that flat, but then along the rest of the feeder we would install that trefoil. And there, along the rest of the feeder, which is along the footpath, the wet public are more likely to be exposed to. So using a couple of simple mitigation techniques like that, we can minimise the risk to all the public that are around. And so we do continuously monitor and we do make sure we implement mitigation measures to protect both our workers and the public around everything. So I believe that's all I had to talk to you today. So thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate the chance to have a chat to you about electromagnetic fields, something that in the wider public isn't necessarily well understood, but something that is particularly relevant to safety and something we all have an obligation to make sure that we minimise the risk and make sure that everybody's safe and the risk is controlled. So thank you for listening.